as of this year, you need to show either a passport or a driver's license or an old person's travel card before you can vote. And I think that last item gives the game away, because a young person can't use their travel card, even if it does have photo ID. So I can't argue against the widespread view that these requirements are pretty deliberately skewed to encourage older as against younger voters for party political reasons. But having said that, I do think that the earlier system did require some change. People have said that there was no evidence of widespread abuse, but since there were no checks, there was always the possibility that abuse was taking place without any evidence coming to light. In practice, if you remember, I mean, people used to take their poll cards along, and the poll clerks would look at them before marking off their names on the electoral register and giving them a ballot form. But if you turned up without a poll card, you were still entitled to vote if you gave a name and address which matched the register. And that does seem unsatisfactory to me. So what I'd argue in favour of a system under which you had to show your poll card with a photo ID as a default option if you've lost it or if the dog's eaten it.
Okay, well, I did interrupt you when you were talking about the difference between fair play. Well, I mean, the various definitions of fair play, but there's also another question, if you can incorporate that into the answer you were already starting to give, which is, the difference between fair play and justice.
Well, I think that's pretty critical if we're going to analyze this concept properly. So, I mean, just to run through the possible means, there's also treating people as they're entitled to be treated is an element of fair play, but also showing good temper in defeat and generosity in victory is often.
We see what happens after the elections, of course.
Yeah, well, you don't go to Stamford Bridge if that's what you want now, that's for sure. But nonetheless, that's often characterized as an element of fair play. I think giving everyone a chance to succeed in life or in whatever enterprise they're involved in is also regarded as an element of fair play. That's what's called the fair go in Australia, of course. I think sympathizing with the underdog is often taken to be an element, of the same thing. And finally, slightly more controversially, but you do definitely find this, that the attitude that one would never sneak on one's friends or grass someone up is very often seen to be part of people's own personal codes of fair play. So 6 ideas, all very close or quite closely interconnected, and they all go to make up the concept. But I think it's refusal to cheat is the basic idea, and
treating people fairly, comes to mind immediately, or not treating them badly if they're your opponent. I mean, we saw last night, of course, another of those debates, which I presume you saw as well. Do you think that concept is actually maintained in the current election, or have we perhaps gone too far? And of course, we have the Trump and Biden one tonight, which I'm sure everyone will stay up to watch at 2 o'clock in the morning.
Well,
has it all sort of been thrown out of the window, really? I mean, we're talking about fair play, but does it exist?
This whole idea of kind of courtesy in elections, it got pretty difficult last night. Now, I must say I don't particularly enjoy these occasions. I was not spellbound by it. But this question of courtesy to your opponents, it's one way of answering it. Can I read an extract from a passage I came across by chance last week?
Yes.
And it's in an essay by the American philosopher Thomas Nagel, and it was written back in the 1970s, but I think it's perhaps just as relevant today in the embittered political atmosphere of the USA. And it'll take about a minute to read. I'll try and get through it quickly. It says, there seems to be a perfectly natural conception of the distinction between fighting clean and fighting dirty. To fight dirty is to direct one's hostility or aggression not at its proper object, but at a peripheral target which may be more vulnerable and through which the proper object can be attacked indirectly. This applies in a fist fight, an election campaign, he says, the duel, or a philosophical argument. If the concept is general enough to apply to all these matters, it should apply to war. both to the conduct of individual soldiers and to the conduct of nations. And that's maybe relevant to some questions later on.
Yes,
But
there is
anyway,
already a question about Gaza.
That's right.
In
Anyway,
the...
Nagel goes on to say, interestingly, I think, suppose you're a candidate for public office, convinced that the election of your opponent would be a disaster, that he's an unscrupulous demagogue who will serve a narrow range of interests and seriously infringe the rights of those who disagree with him. And suppose you're convinced that you can't defeat him by conventional means. Now imagine that various unconventional means present themselves as possibilities. You possess information about his sex life, which would scandalize the electorate if made public. Or you learn that his wife was an alcoholic, or that in his youth he was associated for a brief period with a prescribed political party. And you believe that this information could be used to blackmail him into withdrawing his candidacy. Or you can have a team of your supporters flatten the tires of a crucial subset of his supporters on election day. Or you're in a position to stuff the ballot boxes, or more simply, you can have him assassinated. What is wrong with these methods, says Nagel, given that they will achieve an overwhelmingly desirable result? Well, sadly, in this country, we can't now rule out the assassination of candidates after the deaths of Joe Cox and David Amis. But it's worth considering for a moment one of Nagel's less dramatic scenarios. What about the case where you know your opponent's partner is an alcoholic? And Nagel is almost certainly thinking of what happened to Senator Muskie in the 1972 presidential election. Well, my impression is that we generally don't see candidates' partners and families as fair game in this country. If, again, we look at the contemporary USA, and the way in which Hunter Biden's addiction and legal problems are being weaponized against his father, I think we can conclude with some relief that some of our older traditions of courtesy and restraint in political life aren't quite dead yet.
Well, that's interesting. Well, one of the questions was about Gaza, of course. I mean, this is an extraordinary passage you read to us. But, the idea of fair play, how does it possibly apply in the war in Gaza? And then there was also the question at the same time, because of what you or even what Thomas Nagel was perhaps suggesting, how you can get round the fact or try and avoid having somebody elected that you think would be bad news. Tactical voting.
Yep.
Is that a fair way of going? Is that fair play?
Okay. Should I try Gaza first?
Yes.
Yeah, and I'm going to answer that with a great deal of diffidence because I've got no specialist knowledge, and I do respect the views and the feelings of everyone who disagrees with me about it. But I said earlier on that we tend nowadays to use the language of fair play to describe situations which are less grave than the situations in which we talk about justice. Oh no, I didn't say that, did I? Because I didn't get on about justice.
You almost did.
But that's I mean, fair play. We tend to use in situations of pathetic contests, social situations, things like that. But the much more grave matters, which we have to consider, we do tend to talk about justice. But the concept, I think, is substantially exactly the same. Now, what's happening in Gaza is undeniably extremely grave. I did say that one element in our idea of fair play was our sympathy for the underdog, but I don't think even that captures the situation in Gaza adequately. It's a tragedy in which questions of justice and humanity are contending with questions of national security and politics, with absolutely catastrophic results. And I think, awful as the events of the 7th of September were, I think, and many others think, that the bombardment of civilian areas has been wholly disproportionate. And I'm not convinced that less cruel methods of freeing the hostages, like an intense blockade, could not have worked. But having said that, I do want to make 2 points on the other side. First is that Hamas leaders could easily have foreseen everything that has happened. And it wouldn't surprise me to learn that, in fact, they're probably reasonably happy with the way things have turned out. They must be held equally responsible for everything that's happened. And secondly, however cruel Israel's response has been, its leaders have been under immense pressure from their electorate not to let up, at least until all the hostages are released. And I suspect that there's no democratically elected government in the world that wouldn't have reacted in the same way to the same pressures, however horrific the outcome has been.
Well, it's interesting, really, because quite a lot of what you've written, and certainly the fair play issue, stems from, as you put in the book as well, from war. And also Thomas Nagel talks about situations of war as well, where it is acceptable to do various things, and perhaps, you know, when it comes to war, is a bit different. But you do have a question mark on whether it is an English tradition. But before I get to that, because I want to read a passage myself from your book, but I want to question you a little bit about it. There is an interesting question, which says, you know, a little bit again, going back to the passage you read to us. If you want to achieve particular aims, I mentioned tactical voting. Is it okay to go for tactical voting in order to get the result that you want, even though you're not actually fairly voting for the person you really like? And also, is it acceptable to lie? It's one of the questions there, and we've had quite a lot of that. Is it acceptable to lie for a particular, you know, aim at the end of the day to get a better result?
Okay, let's take tactical voting first, and of course it's only a situation where you don't have proportional representation that tactical voting becomes relevant at all. But since we do live under a system, you know, where we don't have proportionality in voting, I can't see that tactical voting is unfair to anyone. Certainly, no candidate has a right to your vote, and it seems to me that voting against someone is just as much an expression of your free choice as voting for someone. And I think there are people who do see it as slightly disreputable. But suppose you've got to decide between candidate A, who's an absolute monster, candidate B, who's a saint but seems to have no chance at all of winning, and candidate C, who is at least unobjectionable. Well, what's the rational choice? I know what I think anyway. Lying, though, I suppose if you're a utilitarian, then you'd say yes, there are circumstances, yeah, where lying is acceptable in pursuit of a greater cause. But personally, I can't think of any where I could feel it's justified in the context of a general election. I mean, if anyone else has, I'd be interested to consider them. But it poisons the well of democracy so much that I think there has to be a ground rule that, okay, you don't have to tell the whole truth. Of course you don't. But to lie, yeah, I think puts you beyond the pale.
Well, that's interesting, of course. I mean, a lot has happened in the last few years, which shows that that perhaps it's become, perhaps it always was, a much more usual thing among politicians, although, you know, we can't really point the finger at anyone, because we're not in the House of Commons where you are safe. You know, you have immunity if you say that. Whereas they can say that in other places.
But look at the price the last Prime Minister but two paid. You know, when it came back to him. And it was not acceptable to members of his own party. I think, in a sense, the lying was worse than the original offence. I think that will always be a view that commands wide acceptance.
Well, could I then just push you a little bit on the fact that you've got this question mark about an English tradition? And can I just read a passage from Daniel Defoe, who wrote this in 1705, which seems to suggest that perhaps there is such a thing as an English tradition. I think what he's saying is, if I can read it, and probably will not be able to pronounce it all completely correctly, he says that England is particularly famous for the most generous way of fighting in the world. I mean, as to the common people's private quarrels, so the common people, which I thought was rather interesting, while the Dutch mangle one another with knives, the Scotch Highlanders knock one another's brains out with poleaxes, the Irish stab with their, is it skeins? What is it that they use? Skeins? Please
Yeah,
explain that
you
to
got
me.
it.
And Spaniards with the daggers. The Englishmen fairly box it out, and in this way of fighting, the rebels stand by to see fair play, as they call it, which is that when a man is down, 'tis counted foul play and the trick of the coward to strike him, but let him rise and then have at him.
Yeah.
I mean, that is quite interesting. That it's the way you fight. But now, of course, we see that. I mean, as you say,
Yeah.
snitch on each other or whatever is something which perhaps now, particularly if you look at maybe the history of colonialism and everything else,
Yeah.
Whether in fact it has been maintained or not.
Well, that was an interesting quote you read because it was the first time, as far as we know, that anyone had ever said that fair play was a specially English thing. And in my book, I didn't take it for granted. That's why the question mark was important. Yeah, because obviously there's a great deal of chauvinism at work here. So I looked at a lot of evidence for the fair play tradition, and I traced it back a long way into the Middle Ages. And I'm convinced that fair play tradition helped to shape the common law, and it's connected with some underlying notions about shared rights, which are or were unique to this country. But I did find, despite what Daniel Defoe said about the Scottish Highlanders, I found a lot of evidence for the same attitudes in Scotland as well. So my conclusion was that
Oh, well, that's good.
fair play is really a British rather than an English tradition. But it doesn't mean that I think we're uniquely honest as a people. I looked for practical studies on this subject, on things like international studies of how likely people are to cheat in their exams, or hand back money that they find in the street. And it turns out that we're slightly better than the global average, but not that much. So I think the importance of the tradition is not that it makes us into little plaster saints, but that we do have very strong expectations of fair play in our institutions. And we draw on those expectations very heavily when we call our rulers to account. As for colonialism, the way I see it is this. Back in the Middle Ages and the 16th and 17th centuries, fair play was a term used by English men in their relations with each other. They didn't apply it to their dealings with women, and they didn't apply it to their dealings with other races. So it's only with the Enlightenment in the 18th century that we start to get any recognition that the arguments for fair play apply in principle to everybody. And even then, it's a very long drawn out process. And it's only in the mid 20th century that you get a widespread recognition that the very concept of empire is not compatible with the rights and interests of the non-imperial people who belong to it.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the women, of course, because I did want to ask you.
Oh,
now,
yes.
of course, women can vote, but what about the lowering the age, the voting age? Do you think that also makes it fairer, perhaps?
I do. I think there's a sort of intuitive equivalence between the idea that you can earn your own living once you're 16 years old, and the possibility of taking up your full rights and duties as a citizen. And we've had 18 since 1969, but it's been lowered to 16 for elections to the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Assembly. It turns out that 18 is pretty much the normal age all over the world, including places like Russia and China, where the elections aren't remotely free and fair. And there's only a few outliers, like Brazil, Argentina, Austria, going for 16. But I would argue for a reduction to 16, precisely because of that link between. We say you're an adult, you're able to earn your own living. It seems to me that some civic rights come with that. What it does strike me, though, is if you're being strictly logical about this, I suppose it calls into question the right to vote once you've retired. It was probably the votes of the elderly that swung it for Brexit even though they were much less likely to be harmed by the outcome in the long term. So I suppose their right to vote, I should say our right to vote, rests in part on the contribution we've made over our lifetimes and the unremunerated voluntary work that a lot of us still do. And it turns out that there's only one country which has a maximum voting age, and that's the gerontocracy, which is the Vatican City, where cardinals over 80 can't vote in papal elections.
That's interesting because, of course, there is, if I'm not mistaken, there was a suggestion by the Labour Party, or is it, in terms of reforming the House of Lords, certainly to have a retirement age of 80 in the House of Lords. Is that one of the parties suggested it, but I cannot remember which one. Perhaps whoever, all the people who are listening can perhaps send me a little note in the chat.
I think that's right, but I guess they would then have to be given back a right to vote for the members of Parliament of the Commons if they were.
Oh well, that would be
if they were deprived of their voting rights in the Lords.
Oh right, so they can now come and vote.
I don't know if they still have that we have universal suffrage, except for peers and lunatics, which I always think.
Right, well, so is Labour. So Ben, thanks very much. So is Labour. Have it in the manifesto, and yes, you were right, Jonathan. But that's what I remember. So it'll be interesting. But of course, here we are, we're thinking about whether we should take away the vote of the elderly.
Only joking.
Well, of course, we have some people who are probably older than we are, who are debating and want to be presidents of the US and want to be there for the next whatever it is 4 years. And they will be in their 80s in both cases while they're doing so. So quite interesting, really. There are a number of questions that have come about betting. All the scandals that we've just seen. Well, of course, now, I asked you earlier about fair play and justice, but in this case, what we're here today is that the police are now getting involved. It's not just the Gambling Commission. So what's your, obviously, fair play can't possibly be applied in this case if indeed some of those some of those allegations are correct.
No, not one bit. Well, it all seems pretty farcical, doesn't it? But let's assume that some of these people did indeed place bets on the election date, and that suggests that they're in danger of having breached the Gambling Act 2005, and that says that a person commits an offence if he cheats at gambling. Now, it doesn't define cheating, but the case law is very clear that the use of insider knowledge amounts to cheating, as it does when you play the stock market. But I think the difficulty for the investigators is going to lie in establishing at what point your assessment of probability, a hunch, if you like, which you may be only able to make because of your position close to the center of power, becomes insider knowledge. What would be the position, for example, of a diary secretary who noticed that the Prime Minister's clearing his diary for the weeks before July the 4th and reaches the appropriate conclusion before heading off to the betting shop? That's probably quite a hard one to call. Seems to me that the only answer is to have a firm rule that if you're working with ministers as a political aide or a civil servant, you don't make bets on events which are determined by ministerial decisions, just as professional footballers aren't allowed to bet on any matches whatsoever, not just the ones that they're involved in. But I also wonder whether the betting companies should be offering odds on events which are within the scope of individual decisions. It seems to me they're just asking for trouble, just like when they offer.
Yeah, that may be the case, but loads of people put money on Brexit. Even if we have this particular candidate who seems to have bet against himself. But of course, lots of people who wanted to remain bet the other way, I presume, just to even the odds, or at least to have something to fall back on if the vote was for Brexit, and made money. I think even David Davis, I think, said he had put some money on Brexit. I can't remember which way. So odds, it is actually pretty standard for that to happen. And of course, with all the polls and everything else that's going on right now, you would imagine, I mean, there's an awful lot of betting that is going to be taking place, is taking place. I mean,
Well,
I don't know whether actually you can bet on the results. I presume you can.
oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, in fact, I'm in a bet with some of my friends on the results, but fortunately, there's not very much that's riding on it. But
That's between you, but I suppose, yes, that's interesting.
But the position of the MP who bet on himself to lose is quite an interesting one. I mean, putting a bet on Brexit is fine because basically you're trying to guess how, the Prime Minister can't tell you how Brexit's going to go. Yeah, it's basically how 20 or 30 million people are going to split. Yeah, and that's perfectly legitimate. No one knows the answer. But the MP who voted on himself to lose, he might well have had private polls done, which convinced him that he's less likely to win than everyone else thinks he is. And that looks to me as if it's getting close to insider dealing. I mean, I wouldn't particularly want to be in his position when the police come calling.
Well, I presume there are, people going around doing canvassing, and there are canvassing returns that get returned to the offices of the MPs or the candidates, and they get a fair idea of what people think. Possibly.
Yeah, but the MPs, probably if the canvassing results are private, then that could be insider knowledge. I don't know. Anyway, just a thought.
Yes, no, that's very interesting. Now, of course, you are a civil servant, so the role of civil servants is quite an important one, because a lot of what we get is disinformation.
Yeah.
Which, if a politician is using a particular argument and then repeat that argument, let's think, for example, that £2,000 that you were going to be taxed additionally, which was mentioned by Rishi Sunak in the previous debate that he had with Starmer, and of course it turns out it was £2,000 over 4 years, so it was 500 quid instead. Yes. And in any case, it hadn't been properly calculated by the Treasury, even though it was assumed that it was said in that debate that it was done by the independent Treasury, as if there is such a thing. So is this, in terms of being able to trust the civil service, would you say that there is an independent civil service that actually gives the right advice? So there is a question about, can we rely perhaps on Whitehall to give us the right information so we can make our minds? But if you have a minister on top, and I work for the government myself, and also civil servants are not allowed to say anything at all. So how can we, we now have all these fact checkers. So it's quite interesting at the BBC, whenever there is, at the same time that you're watching this debate, you have all these facts being checked to make sure that you're not being lied to, in inverted commas. But of course, just somebody has put in the chat, what you've got is various different ways of looking at things. So you can use a particular statistic to make a point, but you can use the same statistic to make quite a different point, or even the opposite, depending on what you are measuring it against. So how can one, apart from that, in the US there are fact checkers galore. I mean, everything that goes into a newspaper has been fact checked 1,500 times. So how is it at all realistic to expect some sort of independent? I mean, we have the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility. We have think tanks like the Institute for Fiscal Studies who give us some of that information. But what is the role? Do you think that there should also be more information coming out of the civil service, from the civil service, that actually does all this work? All we got from the Treasury is, no, we didn't actually do it. A letter written, which we all saw, by the Permanent Secretary. Saying we were given these figures by the SPADs, really, at times, and we only measured up to a point. So what is your view?
And James Attila asked a great question, to that effect. In general, I think, the problem isn't so much lack of information. It is, as you say, it's a lack of trusted sources. I mean, the government's got huge information teams in every department, but they have to work to a political agenda. Newspapers try and sift the wheat from the chaff. But many of the national papers haven't recovered their credibility since the phone hacking scandal. Local papers are pretty much threatened with oblivion as a resource. People are increasingly getting their information from their favorite internet channels. where there's no effective regulation, of course. I think we do need to be grateful for the reliable resources we do have, and especially the national broadcasters, yeah, and the respected think tanks you mentioned, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the Arm's Length Office for Budget Responsibility. These have actually built up a reputation for credibility, which is much needed in present circumstances, and for which, yeah, I think we need to be very grateful, because otherwise we've got nothing to hold on to.
Well, but
And
the
I
interesting
think,
thing, yeah. Sorry, I was going to say that the interesting thing about those about the civil servants is that at least what we do get information about is that, and not always, is at the time when they do the calculation of value for money of a particular policy,
yeah,
like Rwanda.
mm-hmm.
The Home Office, as I understand it correctly, sorry, if I understand it correctly, said that it was poor value for money,
Mm-hmm.
and said that to the Home Secretary of the time, who I think was Priti Patel.
Mm-hmm.
And they had to be given direction, which is
Yeah.
basically the minister saying, it doesn't matter, we still need to go ahead. That's about the only time when we hear about, disagreement with a policy which has been properly evaluated. And that's about it. And loads of other directions. I know the Institute for Government had done a study that showed that there are loads of times when there have been directions given to the department to go ahead with a policy that they really believed made no sense, which we haven't really necessarily heard about. So what's your view of that? Should that be much more active because again, the questions in the chat are, who is lying, who isn't lying, and the issues are such that you can interpret them in all sorts of different ways.
Well, the system does, as you know better than I do, it does have some inbuilt checks and balances, which are really quite important. And I think the position of the permanent secretary in each department is pretty crucial here, because the permanent secretary has a responsibility not just to the Secretary of State, but also to whatever parliamentary committee he's answerable to. And he has a very personal responsibility for the proper use of public funds. So even a permanent secretary who wants to ingratiate himself with the political party that's in power, which is obviously a very great temptation, nonetheless is aware that if he doesn't take his duty with regard to the proper use of public funds seriously, then he or she, I'm sorry, is going to be in very serious professional trouble. And I think that's a very important check and balance, and it's one which, as you say, has helped to inform our knowledge of the background to the Rwanda policy. And on this more recent thing, where the government at least implied that civil servants had cast a line over the opposition spending plans and had found them to be undeliverable. As you say, the permanent secretary at the Treasury wrote a letter, I think, to Keir Starmer, saying, look, it is not like that. These figures are not validated by the Treasury. And it seemed to be quite encouraging that, the permanent secretary in question was, I believe, the man who was put there by Liz Truss when she found the last one a little too independent-minded and a little too much of an expert for her tastes. So
and fired him as the first thing that she did. Yes,
but
that's
then the
point.
new man has done his duty in correcting this wrong impression that was given during the election. So
that's true. Well, the interesting thing, and one of the comments in the chat is that we talked about independence of the civil service, which of course it isn't necessarily, because they have to do what the minister tells them at the end of the day, and the direction that departments go very much follows what, if you like, the ideals or the ideas are, or the beliefs are of a particular government that's there. So you may wonder about them, but also independent bodies from the outside is the question in the chat. Quite often, they can't calculate exactly what some of the impacts might be, and they could be biased or they could be wrong. So, for example, the Institute of Fiscal Studies had questioned some time ago whether had questioned the ability of of the government to claw back some of the tax that was due to it, or even, you know, do something about tackling some of the abuses on the disability benefits and so on, which they seem to have been able to do and acknowledge that they do that. So it's really just a comment that even those, and I do agree, even those that are perceived to be independent have their flaws, if you like. So we do need to get our information from all sorts of different sources and still make up our minds. But the question is, there was one earlier which says, you know, are we forgetting excellence? In other words, you know, getting the best results by focusing too much on fairness, sort of looking at it from all angles and so on. What do you think about that?
I think I'd like to see that case kind of worked up a little bit. I mean, yeah, I can't immediately see how the two ideas should be in tension with each other. Yeah, okay. I mean, fairness can probably be taken, procedural fairness can probably be taken to ridiculous lengths, as it was in certain public inquiries that I was involved in at one time, and which was part of the reason why they rang up those horribly high bills. But in general, yeah, I would have thought that a reasonable concern for fairness would help in bringing in public acceptance for a policy, and I don't see that is likely to detract from excellence. But you know, I bet very willing to think about it further if people can think of counterexamples.
Yes, I think it's an interesting one, quite a difficult one, and you're quite right. So what would happen if we get a Labour government and they then raise taxes? Would that be considered unfair simply because or a lie, or you know, they may not raise the ones that they said they weren't going to, but I mean, just think of the coalition and raising tuition fees when they made it very clear they wouldn't do so. So first of all, you know, it seems to happen all the time. And the second thing is that unfair? Is there anything one can do about reducing that unfairness? So in other words, can manifestos be tied to really what you need to do? Because if you remember, Nigel Farage, when he introduced his manifesto, which of course he called a contract with the people, said, I'm not calling it a manifesto because manifestos are just lies, basically. Governments come to power and they do something completely different. So there's no point in manifestos because they don't tell you the truth of what is intended. What's your view about that? Does that suggest that there is serious unfairness, and would we then rise in revolt if things do not go according to plan?
Well, I think
or vote them out, which is what happened with the Lib Dems, of course.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it looks to me as if Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves have painted themselves into a bit of a corner. In terms of very clear undertakings they've made not to raise the main income-producing taxes. I'm not quite clear whether in every case it's for the whole of the Parliament or just for a year or two. But whatever they've said, I mean, it seems to me they absolutely have to stick to. Otherwise, they will be paying the electoral consequences for many years to come.
Yes, so basically it's back down to the electorate. Yeah,
it is unfair to them because the Tories can know that they're going to lose the election, and they can be as irresponsible as they want, and they know that Labour will be under immense pressure to match them. But nonetheless, Starmer and Reeves have made these promises, and I don't think there's any wiggle room except in the taxes which they have not made any commitments about, which by and large are probably taxes which will fall on those more able to pay, but which, as I understand it, are not going to fill the hole in NHS finances and all the other things that need to be done. So,
indeed, I think the IFS in its pre-election assessment of the manifestos did say that locking yourself, exactly your point, Jonathan, locking yourself in those rules is terribly dangerous. Because of course it will let loads and loads of people down in the end, and I think it would be considered unfair. So the idea of fair play is going to be with us, I think, throughout the next 4 years.
Equally, they could hardly do otherwise without seeing their poll majority wither away.
Yes,
Yeah, it's
possibly. Can I ask you then, since we're getting towards the closing stages of this, do we need a written constitution to safeguard our values, including those of fair play, assuming, of course, you do still think it's an English tradition? We can take
I
that
do.
question mark
Yeah.
out.
There you go. Well, generally, I'm a bit skeptical about some of the claims that are made that we need a written constitution. That there's so much on which we don't have any kind of consensus. You know, the role of a second chamber, the powers of the devolved administrations, or even whether Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland will eventually sever themselves from England. The proportional representation is not agreed upon. Even the long-term future of the monarchy could be called into question. So I think it would be extremely difficult to get democratic legitimacy for the project of a written constitution, unless whichever party happens to be in power is going to bulldoze the minority and impose its own view. And then I just don't think you have something that is going to be accepted or is going to be a basis, you know, for a civil policy, you know, going on for decades ahead. I mean, I look at the American Constitution and I'm appalled at the way that it enshrines gun rights and it advantages right-wing candidates who gather disproportionate support from small states, and yet it's virtually unamendable. So I think we should be alive to the advantages of our unwritten constitution, but it'll only stay fit for purpose if we maintain our traditions of tolerance and inclusivity and yes, fair play.
Yes, well, you have in the book that the tradition which promoted the idea of the British government as enshrining the values of fairness, the way it was run, and that fairness was the result of a mixed constitution. So this is really why I've asked you that question about the constitution. But the way that they interpreted it, of course, was that they characterized the English polity, so the body of which was running, or the various bodies that were running the country, as one in which, as you put here, the monarch, the House of Lords, and the House of Commons all played independent roles. And because of the way they operated then, in their perception, you found, the English found a way of making sure that there were no extremes in any of those, and some middle ground was found. And the reason why I was particularly interested in that is because, of course, it all stems from the Greeks, as far as I can see, as usual. For the Greeks who are listening, or those from Greece, which, and as you say here, it's Aristotle, really, the philosopher of moderation, as you call him, where he believes that true virtue is the middle way between two opposite vices, as he puts it. But of course, you know, we've got these two opposite supposed views, but in reality, we don't have very opposite views for the moment coming through this election, which is confusing everybody. But as we know, we're having people voting because they want change. But there is a question about fair representation, if you like, of particular views in the chat, which is a really good one, and one that you and I, Jonathan, have discussed separately, which is, you know, yes, it sounds great to be able to represent the views that I just mentioned, whether they're the views of the House of Lords, the views of the House of Commons, say, and the monarch, as was at the time in England. We still have a monarch, of course, here. So the structure is more or less the same, but one monarch who isn't as dominant as perhaps was the case then. But the representation of views in the media, so you can hear all sorts of different views that can make up your mind. The Brexit debate was a classic example where the media believed that fairness was shown and balanced argument by just always having somebody who could argue the opposite in those debates, rather than going into deep discussion about the merits of one or the other. So, you know, I was involved in a number of those. I'm sure a number of people who are listening to this were as well. And there were just a handful of people who were in favor of Brexit from the economic side, and yet we were pitted against each other as if that was a balanced way of doing it. So what do you think about that?
Let me go back briefly.
And that's going to have to be the last one, I think, or nearly the last one, because we'll have to finish off pretty soon.
Well, I'll go back briefly to what you were saying about the mixed constitution, and I see a question flashed up about the House of Lords. You know, how can that be fair play? I think the mixed constitution is pretty much now consigned to the dustbin of history. Yeah, I mean, since the monarch can't say no to legislation, and the House of Lords haven't had a veto since 1911. But nonetheless, the idea was important because it helped to foster a culture of moderation, which we don't really appreciate enough. I mean, this whole idea that the expectation that the leader of the party which gets fewer seats is going to cede gracefully to the winner is something that we've always taken for granted until 2020, when we saw what happened on the other side of the pond. And now, we've got, we can no longer see that, or rather, we have to recognize the strength of the tradition that we have here. And what I say in my book is that just as this tradition of kind of going out gracefully when you get fewer seats in Parliament stems from the early 18th century, probably goes back to Sir Robert Walpole, people like that. It's very much at the same time when the rules of our games are starting to be codified, and they're embodying aspects of fair play as well. And I think this analogy between the political process and a game is one that's well worth exploring. I'm certainly not the first person to think of it, but I've tried to work out its implications in my book. And if suddenly the rules of that game are cast to one side by a politician who's not prepared to accept the democratic result, I think we're all in trouble.
Yeah, I agree. Now, of course, the last question really for me, because we did have another couple of minutes, and you answered things quite quickly. That was very helpful, Jonathan. Is the role of the civil service and the public servant, because we did speak a little bit about that and how independent or not they are. But a number of the scandals that have come out recently are not necessarily politicians' faults. Well, they could be, because they were a bit useless in terms of perhaps not realizing there were problems there. But also, the contaminated blood scandals. Well, Windrush, of course, which was more political, I suppose, than anything else. And the post office scandal, for example. I mean, all those are suggest to anyone who's looking at this that there is also a body of public servants who don't want to accept that something's gone wrong, and who carry on, doing. I mean, you were a civil servant for some time, so was I. So there is an unfairness there. I mean, that notion of fair play, how you deal with people, is one which seems to have fallen by the by recently, because those scandals involve both civil servants or bodies that exist in the public sector, and ministers at the same time who are compliant, if you like. And a lot of the, so we seem to be much worse here than in other countries. So I'm going back to the question mark about fair play. So, similar scandals like the blood one, contaminated blood, have been settled a lot earlier. In places like France, for example. People have gone to jail for it. We seem to not quite get there unless there is a whistleblower or somebody who really makes a fuss. So this is the final thing, because Ben is going to come on in a second and tell me we've overrun. So we need to be, I'm not necessarily asking you to answer this completely, but does this then suggest that actually, maybe the question mark should be there, stay there, because we seem to have gone backwards in that respect?
I think what these things, what these scandals have shown, is that there is a huge problem of corporate mindsets in the civil service. And from my own experience in the Home Office, I know that people who were looking at immigration applications saw it as the essence of their job to detect people who were fraudulent in their applications. And a few years later, I mean, this was the absolute core of the Windrush scandal. Oh, you haven't got the right documents. I don't care if you say you've been here for 20 years, you're off. But to me, the incredible failure there was the failure of senior management and politicians to put it right while they still had the chance to do so. I think it was Amelia Gentleman in the Guardian who first warned of this scandal, and there were at least 6 months between then and Amber Rudd's misstatement on the subject before the Commons Committee, which led to her resignation. 6 months in which this could have been put right by energetic action. And I think you've got the same kind of mindset, with the post office scandal. Again, people put the interests of their institution as they conceive them narrowly before the most basic ideas of fair play. So I'm afraid, yes, unless we can find better management methods, we will continue to have these scandals.
Well, that's very depressing way to end this. But thank you very much, Jonathan. And Ben is there to make sure that we finish on time. I can see his face. But Jonathan, really, really great to have involved, and all of you, of course, for all your questions and contributions. So Ben, over to you.
Look, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to Vicky for sharing and rattling through all of those your questions and adding questions of her own, keeping the conversation flowing, but particularly to you, Jonathan, for giving of your time and sharing some of the thoughts from your books, but other sort of thoughts to bring us up to speed with the election. I'm conscious that one of Radix's big pieces of work after the general election is going to be to look at the issues of political reform. Really, really fascinating discussion. 3 things just to finish with. You've only scraped the surface of your book, so please do have a look in the chat, download the link, and do, if you can, purchase a copy of Jonathan's book in return for his time tonight. Very much appreciated. Secondly, if you've enjoyed this evening, our next session is on Monday at 1 o'clock with Lord Daniel Finkelstein and Tim Bale, looking at what happens next after the election, particularly focused on the state of the right in British politics, but also the nature of the opposition that we'll have. So secondly, do sign up for that session. I see it also appearing in the chat as I speak. And thirdly, if you've found tonight interesting and entertaining, I suppose you could have spent £15 on a cinema ticket, and you'd have had to go outside and not have your pleasant drink by the side of you. Why not consider making a donation to Radix to help us in the work that we do and organising sessions of this kind? And again, you'll find a link on the chat to help you to do that. So thanks once again to Jonathan. Thank you to everybody for joining us. And I look forward to seeing many of you at our future discussions, and certainly on Monday. Thank you and good night.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.